Hello again, friends and fellow truth seekers. Mike Nicholas here with another episode of the Soul Unleashed podcast, where my goal is to help you break out of old paradigms, ask the right questions in your search for deeper meaning for your life, and help you shift from a spiritual skeptic to a free thinker. Let's dive in with today's adventure. Hello again, friends and fellow truth seekers. This is Mike, and welcome back to the Soul Unleashed podcast. Today we're going to talk about the Bible and specifically some biblical accuracy issues that I have. And although this might be controversial to some of my friends, especially those whom I know and love and take the Bible literally, I have questions about this particular story we're about to discuss. What started all this was me seeing a video. I think I may have seen it on Facebook or something, but it was one of those typical videos where American soldiers are returning home from being deployed and they surprise their children. There's a number of different scenarios, men and women, but the soldier, sneaks up on his child or her child and, they turn around, see them, and there's hugging and tears. And it's always a tearjerker. It always impacts and affects me. I, of course, was a soldier and deployed. I was one of those people who came home to the hugs of my children running to see me. So I understand all this, and I think it's wonderful, and I enjoyed the video. The one I saw recently went a little bit further than that, and it showed soldiers from other countries and other ages returning home. Had a picture of American Indians or Native Americans returning to their Indian village and being greeted by their children. Roman soldiers, the American Civil War, North and South, returning home and being greeted by their families. Roman soldiers being greeted by their families. The point is, I think, that love is universal and that all of us who serve, we have many loved ones who wait anxiously for our return and pray for our safekeeping, and they're anxious to see us come back home and overjoyed when we do so. So this brought me to think about a piece of the Bible that I had read a long time ago, but it keeps coming back in different contexts, and that's the story of the king of Jerusalem, Hezekiah, and the Assyrian army, which besieged Jerusalem, and how he was, according to the Bible, delivered from this particular attack. To put this in context, basically, there were two kingdoms of Israel. There was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was comprised of primarily Jerusalem and the area surrounding the Jerusalem, and that's called the Judean or the Judah kingdom, and Hezekiah was the Judah king. He reigned, I guess, towards the end of the 6th century BC, and he was not happy about being a vassal to the Assyrians. There's a whole lot of political context involved in this, but the Assyrians, in the 4th year of his reign, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, completely leveled it, destroyed it, and the reason given in the Bible was that the people in the north had drifted from God, had started worshiping idols, they had other gods, they were unfaithful to God, etc., and so the just God in his just anger, wiped them out, or had the Assyrians do his work and wipe them out. So now, in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, the Assyrians were coming up against him. And he knew they were coming for some period of time. He had been talking to the king, he'd been talking to the king's representatives. He didn't want to be a vassal state to the Assyrians, who had a much larger army, a vast army, and they were coming to subjugate him again. And he spent a lot of time building up Jerusalem, building up Israel, building up the walls of the castle. He dug a tunnel to a spring that provided water for Jerusalem because they were going to be under siege, and did a lot of preparation. What I want to read to you is just a couple sentences from the Bible, which recount what happened when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came and had his army outside of Jerusalem. So Hezekiah knew that, of course, that the army was there. He went and prostrated himself before the Lord, and Hezekiah had done a lot of work in terms of bringing people back to God, having the one temple for the one true God in Jerusalem, and he prayed to God to be delivered from the Assyrians. So here's what the Bible says. It's from Isaiah 37 and also from 2 Kings chapter 19. Quote, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, they were all dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there, unquote. So that's the biblical account of what happened. And the sudden destruction of the Assyrian soldiers by the angel of death resulted in the lifting of the siege and, of course, protected Jerusalem from invasion. Hezekiah became a hero, celebrated in the Bible as such. He won everything he did according to the Bible. I forget the exact wording, but he's complimented for winning everything that he did because he was favored by the Lord. And it's a great story unless you know you're an Assyrian soldier, right? So I was thinking about this in terms of the video I had seen with American soldiers and all these other soldiers from different countries coming back, and the universality of loved ones waiting for us. And I thought, what's a recent example? How many people might have been affected by that action by God of killing all that many soldiers? And what kind of God would do something like that? So I turned to AI, which is helpful in some situations, and I asked for a recent example, and it brought up the tragic bombing at Kabul in Afghanistan, Abbey Gate, which took place in 2021. And that particular attack, that bomb, resulted in the death of 13 U.S. service members and approximately 170 Afghan civilians. So trying to determine how many family members, immediate family members, may have been affected by the loss of these 13 service members, required specific data on each individual, which is not publicly available, nor should it be. But AI did something which I thought was brilliant, and it used a estimating method to calculate this, and it calculated in three areas. One was marital status, second was children, and the third was parent and siblings. So it said that approximately 55.7% of active duty Army personnel are married, with similar percentages across the other branches. In terms of children, among active duty members, about 43.7% have children, and parents and siblings, it's reasonable to assume that most service members have at least one living parent and may also have siblings. So based upon those general calculations, it did the number crunching and basically said that with the Abbey Gate bombing and the loss of 13 personnel, about 58 immediate family members were affected. So that's a lot more than 13, obviously, but 58 members suffered the tragedy and the horror and the loss of losing a loved one in that bombing. So I asked AI to do the same calculation, kind of using that same formula against the biblical count of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And I'm not going to bore you with all the calculations, but the bottom line is AI calculated that as a result of that angel of death's action killing 185,735 soldiers, it was 819,735 immediate family members that would have been affected. So almost 820,000 people. Now, AI also said that, there's obviously some cultural and historical differences between soldiers of the ancient Assyria and American soldiers. The structure and size of families was very different. They practiced polygamy with various family sizes, so there were probably even a lot more wives and children that were involved than this modest calculation does. But 820,000 people were affected by the angel of death. Now, my initial thought was, is this the God that I know and love that would permit such horror, such pain to be inflicted upon that many people? I turned to looking for some other sources that might help me better understand what that was, and it led me to familiar ground I've been on before, which is the problem of evil. Why does God permit evil to exist, and what's the purpose of evil? That concept or that discussion is called theodicy, or the problem of evil. And many theologians and philosophers have addressed this issue throughout many, many centuries. It's way beyond the scope of my little podcast. And I don't pretend to understand why God does what he does or permits evil. However, there were two books that I came across which kind of helped me better understand this. And one was called A God at War by a theologian named Gregory Boyd. And the other one has to do with archaeological evidence in Israel. Now, Boyd is relatively recent, right? 1997, he wrote his book. The other theologians that I've came across that discussed the concept of the problem of evil is C.S. Lewis, St. Thomas Aquinas, other famous church doctors have all looked at this kind of thing and what the problem, why does God permit this to happen? Boyd has a pretty interesting perspective. I think traditional Christianity looks at this as though God permits evil to happen, and it's all part of God's mysterious plan why evil is permitted to happen. Boyd, however, suggests that suffering, evil, violence result primarily from a vast cosmic spiritual conflict that's going on rather than directly from God's sovereign will. This is very different from the current Christian interpretation. And that evil arises and happens because of the rebellious activity of spiritual beings, demons, Satan, who are opposed to God's intention. So sometimes God loses. Sometimes evil wins. This battle is constantly going on, not because God wills evil to happen, but because evil triumphs over good in some situations. Now, Boyd does say that in the end, that God has ultimate victory. His ultimate victory is assured, but evil events on earth occur due to genuine opposition, not because God actively wills it to be so. So that's the book God at War, and when he looks at the thing with the Assyrians happening, that's interpreted as evil winning basically over God's intention. I don't quite get the whole thing about how Boyd applies that to the Assyrians, because the Bible makes it pretty clear that it was God that did that, trying to protect Israel and trying to make Hezekiah, his favored king or favorite person. And Hezekiah was obeying God, and that's why God protected him. But that is Boyd's conclusion about how good and how evil happens, and a little bit different from what I've read before. The second book was even more interesting. It's called The Bible Unearthed, and it's by two archaeologists, a gentleman named Finkelstein, another gentleman named Silberman. Both of these references will be in the show notes. They look at the historical context of how the Bible was written, and then they look at all the archaeological evidence to see if that supports that. Specifically, they spend a lot of time looking at the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, which are common to both Jewish tradition and Christian tradition. And that the Pentateuch covers the period from, it's 5 books, but it covers the period from the Garden of Eden, if you will, Adam, through the Exodus, and the Israelites are about to enter Canaan after they escape from Egypt. That period of time is looked at, and what I want to do is I want to talk about what they say about the Assyrians, because they do specifically address that story in the Bible. But just to give you an example of how they look at things, prior to this book, when was this written? This book was written in 2001. So prior to this book, the way that archaeology in the Holy Land, if you will, was approached was that they had the Bible, and then they'd go in search of things to prove that the Bible was right. So the Bible said this happened here, then they would go and dig to find evidence to support what the Bible said, which is fine, and that worked out in a lot of cases. But what these guys did, these archaeologists, is they ignored the Bible, just did as much archaeological evidence and research as they could, and then, based upon what they found and using archaeological techniques and processes, and I guess the way archaeology is supposed to be done, they came up with the story, and then they went to the Bible to see if it matched what they had found on the archaeological side. So it's kind of very different from previous biblical research. Just as an example, though, about what they did, they looked for evidence of any civilizations in the Sinai Peninsula or the area where the Exodus supposedly occurred. All of us have seen the movie, Moses with Charlton Heston and the Israelites escaping from Egypt, and Charlton Heston and Moses standing on a hill and parting the Red Sea, and the whole story about Joseph and the amazing Technicolor coat and how they wound up in Egypt in the first place. That whole narrative, that whole story is something most Christians believe in, right? That's something that I grew up with and seeing all the time. they can find no evidence of some 600,000 Israelites wandering around the Sinai Peninsula. The Bible says 600,000. They couldn't find any evidence of anybody during that period of time. Now, I should point out that archaeologists have tools nowadays that can find even the most minute traces of civilization going back to the Stone Age. With ground-penetrating radar and all these other tools, they can find evidence that small villages existed in the mountains or, in the Balkans. They can find whatever they can find very clear evidence that people existed in certain spaces. The stories as told in the Bible about the Exodus names specific places. So one might say, well, maybe they looked in the wrong spot in the desert. That might be true, but the accounts in the book of the Bible are definite enough that they can tell the cities that they were close to, and apparently they spent a whole lot of time around one specific city, according to the Bible. Anyway, no evidence of any of that exists. They did find evidence of Egyptian army posts and forts that were spread throughout the Sinai, that had the Israelites been such a large group of people wandering around, they would have bumped into many more Egyptians. There's no account on the Egyptian side of any of that happening. Just to spoil the book for you, the conclusion about that specific period, I'm going to address the Assyrians in a second, but that specific period, the Exodus, the conclusion about that is that the Israelites never left Canaan. They were always in Canaan. That's where they came from. And so all the stories about them fighting in Canaan are backed by much archaeological evidence, including the Assyrian story. But they were already there. They didn't go to Egypt and escape and wander in the desert. There's a reason why that story was told, however, and the conclusion of these guys, just to at least tell you what their conclusion is that the Old Testament's historical narrative is not a literal account of events, but rather it's a product of stories developed for political and religious reasons during the 7th century BC. The king at that time was Josiah. He was another southern king, and in Jerusalem, and he was trying to unite the people of Israel against both Egypt and the Assyrians, and that's why he told these specific stories, and he didn't make them all up. They were developed over centuries and centuries, but that's why they were compiled and put together in these books during his reign. So back to the Assyrians. So the Assyrians were large. They dominated that part of the Middle East. This is the 600s before BC. Hezekiah was king, and the northern section of Israel was destroyed in the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign, according to the Bible. And it says very clearly that the Assyrians came and destroyed it. And the reason they destroyed it was because they had not followed God. They had wandered from God. They had, not had one true God. They had multiple gods, etc. So that's what happened with the northern kingdom. Hezekiah did not want that to happen in the southern kingdom, but he did want to break away from the Assyrians. So he fortified Israel over many months, even a year. I think he had a lot of time between the time that the Assyrians came, he was talking to them, etc., that he knew they were going to attack Jerusalem. And he prostrated himself before God, and he said, he went to the temple and said, "Please deliver me from the Assyrians." And God spoke to him somehow, said, "Yes, we'll do that. I'll protect you, and you've done my commandments and whatever." So I don't mean to be glib about this, but the Bible explains in a lot more detail what happened. But quite clearly, the Bible wants you to understand that Hezekiah was under the protection of God, and it was for that reason that he was delivered from the Assyrians. So the Assyrians are outside the gates, and as I've already explained to you, they were all killed. And what I want you to know is this book explains a different perspective. The book looks at other sources, not just those that are found in Israel. Obviously, there were other civilizations, and there's records of these civilizations that were fighting the Israelites, that touched them at different times and fought with them, and they have their own account of what happened in history. So the archaeological evidence supports the preparation of Jerusalem. They found the walls, they found the tunnel to the spring. They found a lot of the stuff that Hezekiah had done to fortify Jerusalem. So that's kind of cool that all the stuff the Bible talks about actually happened in Jerusalem. But on the Assyrian side, there's a lot of evidence and proof that what they thought happened did what the Bible said happened did not happen. For example, there is a section in the Bible where it says that it's also in 2 Kings. It's kind of just as one sentence that says that the king, his name is Sennacherib, that King Sennacherib and the Assyrians had wiped out all the minor cities around Jerusalem on the way to Jerusalem. Well, one of those cities, it was not minor, it's called Lachish. And Lachish was a very large city, one of the most important cities besides Jerusalem. And there's a relief that they found. It's an Assyrian relief, and it was in the palace of Sennacherib in Nineveh. And it was found, I don't know, the British explorers, the British were really into this, like the 1840s. And they discovered this relief. And the relief tells a story of Sennacherib destroying Lachish. And it shows ramps being built. And if you get this book, it's got a little picture of the relief. But it's very detailed about how they went about destroying the city of Lachish. Now, one might say, well, that's the story of the Assyrians. The Israelites have their own story, right? So who are you supposed to believe? The archaeological evidence appears to support just to cut to the chase, to support the Assyrians. Here's a story that they found also in the annals, or the history of the Assyrian people. So just to make it as clear as I can, the Israelites and Hezekiah have their own tale about what happened. That's in the Bible. This is what they found in the Assyrian records. I'm going to read it to you. It's just about 4 or 5 sentences. And he describes it very concisely and pretty coldly as far as what they did. Quote, "As to Hezekiah the Judahite, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them all by means of well-stamped earth ramps, battering rams brought thus near to the walls, combined with the attack by foot soldiers, using mines, breaches, and as well as sapper work. I drove out of them 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, big and small cattle, beyond counting, and considered them booty. Himself," meaning Hezekiah, "himself I made prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthwork in order to molest those who were leaving his city's gate. His towns, which I had plundered, I took away from his country, and I gave them over to Mitni, king of Ashad, Padi, king of Ekron, and Silbil, king of Gaza. Thus, I reduced his country, but I still increased the tribute." Unquote. So that is the story of how it happened by the Assyrians. That's 180 from what the Bible says. What does the archaeological evidence support? In short, it supports the Assyrian account. They were able to find many of these cities, including Lachish. They were able to find the ramps that were built by the Assyrians during that period. They were able to find the destroyed cities. Many of them never recovered. And the rubble and the evidence of fire and destruction they found date from this period of time when this happened. So it shows certainly that the plunder took place outside of Jerusalem. Now, true to what God and to what the prophets had said, the king of Sennacherib, he did not enter Jerusalem. He surrounded it, like he says here in his description. He surrounded it literally with earthen walls, which they've also found, and kept Hezekiah like a prisoner in Jerusalem. Eventually, Hezekiah died, and his son, who was 12 years old, took over Manasseh, and he eventually became a vassal state of the Assyrians. He brought back idols. He brought back other worship. He let people, basically, he let the people on the outside of Jerusalem start to worship other gods besides the one true God. and the Bible destroys him for that. He's considered like the worst king ever because he allowed Israel to return to idol worship, if you will. However, in the eyes of the Assyrians, that was good stuff. And so he became initially a vassal state and then became a favored vassal state. And they know this because they found records where they were charging him less in terms of tribute than they charged other states that were even smaller than Jerusalem. So that's a story of two stories about what happened to all those soldiers that were killed. Either happened or didn't happen. If it did happen, I have a little problem with that, big problem with that, because that's not the God that I know and love. And it's just interesting to read this account that basically the account of the Assyrians, which mentions nothing about losing 185,000 soldiers. You'd think they would record that. When they have these reliefs that they found in the palace in Nineveh, they have tablets that record this story on them about the subjugation of Hezekiah. Had they lost that many soldiers, it's hard to believe they wouldn't have recorded that somehow. Such an unusual and terrible thing happening that affected 820,000 family members. So that's the story. That's kind of what I got carried away with, and just contributes to my whole the Soul Unleashed thing, where I question. For those of you who are convinced the Bible's literal, I'm sorry, but I question some of the stories and how they came about. And if you're interested in the history of the Bible and maybe how it was written and where it came from and why these stories persist, you might want to consider reading this book. Like I said, I'll put them both in the show notes so that you know how to find them. Thank you. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.